The first time Prudence Hamilton saw her husband's face was through the soot-stained window of the westbound train as it pulled into the dusty station of Copper Creek, Colorado. She had been certain, from the moment she'd agreed to this arrangement, that her fate was sealed a life of servitude to a cruel, demanding master who had purchased her like cattle. Instead, the tall figure waiting on the platform held a small bouquet of prairie wildflowers, his hat respectfully removed as the train screeched to a halt. It was 1878, and Prudence's options in Boston had dwindled to nothing after the influenza took her parents and left her with nothing but mounting debts. At 22, she had resigned herself to becoming a mail-order bride, answering an advertisement from a Colorado rancher named Grant Anderson. His letters had been brief, businesslike, listing requirements rather than desires, seeking capable woman for cooking, cleaning, child-rearing. There had been no poetry, no promises of affection, just terms like a contract. Prudence clutched her small valise as she descended from the train, her legs stiff from the 5-day journey. The western sun was blinding after days in the dim passenger car, and she squinted as she searched for the man who now owned her future. She had only the vaguest description: tall, 30 years of age, owner of the Double, a ranch 10 miles outside of town. Miss Hamilton. The voice was deeper than she expected, with a gentle quality that didn't match her imagined version of Grant Anderson. She turned toward it and found herself looking up at a weathered face with kind eyes the color of a summer sky. His hair was the rich brown of freshly turned earth, and though his skin was tanned from the sun, she could see he wasn't much older than 30. Mr. Anderson. She asked, her voice barely audible above the hissing of the train. He nodded once, then extended the wildflowers. "Welcome to Copper Creek. I hope your journey wasn't too arduous." Prudence stared at the flowers, confusion washing over her. In all her preparations for this new life, she had steeled herself for coldness, for commands issued without care, for a man who viewed her as merely another piece of property to manage. The flowers trembled slightly in his outstretched hand. "For me?" she asked foolishly. The corner of his mouth lifted. "Unless there's another bride I'm expecting today." She took the bouquet, her fingers brushing his. They were calloused and rough, a working man's hands, but his touch was careful. "Thank you," she murmured, bringing the flowers to her nose. Their sweet scent reminded her that she hadn't smelled anything pleasant in days, just the stale air of the train car and the acrid smoke of the engine. "I've got the wagon just over there," Grant said, nodding toward a sturdy buckboard hitched to 2 chestnut horses. "Do you have any other luggage?" "Just one trunk," she replied, pointing to where the porter was unloading baggage. Grant nodded and gestured for her to follow him. "You must be tired and hungry. Mrs. Finch at the hotel has prepared a meal for us before we head to the ranch. I thought you might appreciate a chance to rest and refresh yourself before the final journey." Prudence followed him, clutching the flowers like a lifeline. This wasn't what she had expected. This man wasn't what she had expected. She had been prepared for the worst: a gruff, demanding husband who would see her as nothing more than a convenience, a way to ensure his meals were cooked and his house kept in order. But this man who had greeted her with flowers instead of orders left her bewildered. Grant secured her trunk to the wagon with practiced efficiency, then helped her up onto the seat. His hands were strong but gentle as they lifted her, and he was careful not to touch her more than necessary. When he climbed up beside her, he left as much space as the narrow bench would allow. "I imagine Boston is quite different from what you'll find here," he said as he guided the horses toward the center of town. Prudence nodded, taking in the wooden buildings lining the wide, dusty Main Street. Copper Creek wasn't large, perhaps 20 structures in all, with a general store, a saloon, a small church, and various other establishments necessary for frontier living. "It's smaller than I expected," she admitted. "The town is still growing," Grant replied. "When I first arrived 8 years ago, there were only 5 buildings and a collection of tents." He glanced at her. "The ranch is isolated, I should warn you. We're 10 miles out and the nearest neighbor is 3 miles beyond that. Winters can be long and companionship scarce." She nodded again, wondering if this was his way of telling her that she would be lonely, that her life would be one of isolation and drudgery. But his next words surprised her. "I've prepared a room for you at the house," he continued. "Your own room, I want you to understand that I—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I know this arrangement is not traditional, Miss Hamilton. You've traveled across the country to marry a stranger, and that takes considerable courage. I respect that courage, and I want you to know that I do not expect. That is to say, we will be married tomorrow by Reverend Walsh, as I mentioned in my letter, but I will not insist upon certain aspects of marriage until you are comfortable." Prudence felt heat rising to her cheeks. In all her fears about this arrangement, she had tried not to dwell on the marital bed, on the fact that this man would have every legal right to her body. Now he was offering her time, consideration. It was unexpected and left her at a loss for words. "Thank you," she finally managed, staring down at the wildflowers in her lap. They arrived at the Copper Creek Hotel, a 2-story wooden structure with a broad porch. Grant helped her down from the wagon and escorted her inside, where a plump woman with silver-streaked hair greeted them warmly. "So this is your bride," the woman exclaimed, embracing Prudence with surprising familiarity. "I'm Edith Finch, dear. Welcome to Copper Creek. Grant here has been pacing the floors for days waiting for your arrival." Prudence glanced at Grant, who looked slightly embarrassed by Mrs. Finch's words. "Mrs. Finch exaggerates," he said, but there was a warmth in his voice that suggested a comfortable relationship with the older woman. "Nonsense," Mrs. Finch replied, winking at Prudence. "He's been like a cat on hot bricks. Now come along. I've prepared the private dining room for you both, and there's hot water upstairs if you'd like to freshen up first." Gratefully, Prudence followed Mrs. Finch to a small bedroom on the second floor, where a copper basin of steaming water awaited her. Once alone, she removed her travel-stained gloves and washed her face and hands, then unpinned her hair and brushed out the tangles. She had done her best to maintain her appearance during the journey, but dust and soot had found their way everywhere. As she repinned her dark chestnut hair, she studied her reflection in the small mirror. Her green eyes looked back at her, filled with uncertainty. What had she gotten herself into? She had been prepared for harshness, for a life of servitude. She had not been prepared for kindness. When she descended the stairs, Grant was waiting in the small dining room off the main restaurant area. He rose when she entered, pulling out her chair with a courtesy she hadn't expected from a frontier rancher. The table was set with simple but clean china, and the aroma of roast beef and fresh bread made her stomach growl audibly. Grant smiled at the sound. "I thought you might be hungry. Train food is rarely satisfying." "It's been a while since I've had a proper meal," she admitted as he took his seat across from her. Mrs. Finch bustled in with platters of food: roast beef, potatoes with gravy, fresh green beans, and warm bread. "Eat up," she instructed. "You'll need your strength for the journey to the ranch." As they ate, Grant told her about the Double A Ranch, named for his family name, Anderson. It had been a small operation when he purchased it 8 years ago, but he had expanded it to over 2,000 acres with a herd of nearly 500 cattle. He employed 5 cowboys full-time with additional hands during the busy seasons. "The house isn't grand," he warned her. "It's solid and weathertight with 4 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a parlor. I've added on as I could over the years." "It sounds more than adequate," Prudence replied, thinking of the tiny apartment above the millinery shop where she had lived after her parents' deaths. "There's a vegetable garden behind the house," Grant continued, "and a chicken coop. We're fairly self-sufficient, though we make regular trips into town for supplies." As they talked, Prudence began to form a clearer picture of the life awaiting her. It would be hard work, certainly, but not the nightmare scenario she had imagined. Grant seemed reasonable, even considerate. Still, she reminded herself, it was easy to be pleasant in town, in public. The true test would come at the ranch, away from watchful eyes. After the meal, Grant suggested she might want to purchase any necessary supplies before they left town. "We won't be back for at least 2 weeks," he explained, "and there might be items you need that I haven't thought to provide." They walked to the general store where Grant introduced her to the proprietor, a thin man with spectacles named Timothy Wells. "My bride, Miss Hamilton," Grant said, and though the words were simple, there was a note of pride in his voice that caught Prudence by surprise. Mr. Wells smiled warmly. "A pleasure, Miss Hamilton. We don't get many new faces in Copper Creek, especially not ones as pretty as yours." Prudence thanked him, feeling suddenly self-conscious. She was aware of the curious glances from other customers, a woman in a calico dress with two young children, an elderly man examining tools, a young couple whispering together by the fabric bolts. News traveled fast in small towns, and she supposed her arrival was the most interesting thing to happen in Copper Creek for some time. Grant gave her space to browse, telling her to select whatever she needed. She moved through the store, considering practical items like soap, hairpins, and writing paper. When she paused by a display of fabric, running her fingers over a bolt of soft blue calico, Grant appeared at her side. "Do you sew?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes, I've made most of my own clothes since I was a girl." "Take whatever you'd like," he said. "Winter evenings are long at the ranch. It's good to have projects." Prudence hesitated, unused to such generosity. "I wouldn't want to be extravagant," Grant's expression softened. "It's not extravagance to have a few comforts, Prudence." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent an unexpected shiver through her. She selected the blue calico and a length of cream-colored muslin, along with thread, buttons, and other notions. By the time they left the store, the wagon was loaded with her purchases, as well as supplies Grant had ordered in advance of her arrival. The sun was lowering toward the western horizon as they set out for the Double A Ranch. Prudence watched as the town of Copper Creek fell away behind them, replaced by rolling grasslands dotted with pine and aspen. The road, little more than a rutted trail, wound through meadows bright with late summer wildflowers. "It's beautiful," she said, breaking a long silence. Grant glanced at her, then back to the road. "It is different from the east, but it has its own kind of beauty, harsher maybe, but honest." They passed several homesteads, small cabins with fields of corn or wheat surrounding them. As they traveled further, the dwellings became scarcer, the land wilder. Prudence saw a herd of antelope in the distance, and once a red fox crossed the road ahead of them, pausing to stare at the wagon before disappearing into the tall grass. "Are there many dangerous animals?" she asked, thinking of stories she'd heard about the west wolves, bears, mountain lions. "Some," Grant admitted. "But they generally keep their distance if you're sensible. We lose the occasional calf to wolves or lions, but attacks on humans are rare." The sun was setting when they crested a hill, and Grant pulled the horses to a stop. "There," he said, pointing to a valley below them. "That's the Double A." Prudence leaned forward, eager for her first glimpse of her new home. The ranch spread out across the valley floor, nestled against a backdrop of pine-covered hills. A two-story house stood in the center, surrounded by several outbuildings, a large barn, a bunkhouse, corrals, and what looked like a smokehouse and storage sheds. A stream cut through one corner of the property, its banks lined with willows and cottonwoods. In the pastures beyond, she could make out the dark shapes of cattle grazing in the fading light. "It's larger than I expected," she said. Grant nodded. "It's grown over the years. When I first came here, there was just a one-room cabin and a lean-to for the horses." He flicked the reins, and the horses started down the hill. "Are you nervous?" he asked after a moment. Prudence considered lying but decided against it. "Yes," she admitted. "This is all very unfamiliar." "For me as well," he said quietly. "I've been alone for a long time." There was something in his tone that made her wonder about his past, about what had led a seemingly kind man to seek a bride through an advertisement rather than among the women of his acquaintance. But before she could frame a question, they were approaching the ranch buildings, and several men emerged from the bunkhouse to greet them. "This is Jake Sullivan, my foreman," Grant said, introducing a weathered man of about 40 with a thick mustache. "And these are Pete, Sam, and the Tolliver brothers, Tom and Frank." The men nodded politely, though Prudence could see the curiosity in their eyes. Jake stepped forward and touched the brim of his hat. Welcome to the AA, madam. Boss has been talking about your arrival for weeks. Grant cleared his throat. That'll do, Jake. I'm sure Miss Hamilton is tired from her journey. Jake grinned, unrepentant. Just telling the truth, boss. You've had us fixing up the house like the president himself was coming to visit. Prudence couldn't help but smile at the obvious affection and teasing between the men. It spoke of a workplace where respect didn't preclude friendship, which seemed like a good sign. Grant helped her down from the wagon, then carried her trunk as he led her toward the house. It was a substantial structure built of squared logs with a wide porch across the front. In the fading light, Prudence could see curtains at the windows and a rocking chair on the porch, small touches of domesticity that surprised her. Inside, Grant lit a lamp, revealing a parlor furnished with a sofa, two comfortable-looking chairs, and a small writing desk. A stone fireplace dominated one wall and bookcases lined another. The furnishings were simple but of good quality, and everything was surprisingly clean and orderly for a bachelor's home. I've had Mrs. Finch's daughter, Sarah, coming out twice a week to keep the place in order, Grant explained, seeming to read her thoughts. But it'll be good to have someone here full-time. He hesitated, then added, not that that's the only reason I wanted a wife. Prudence waited, curious about what other reasons he might offer, but he simply picked up her trunk again and led her up a narrow staircase to the second floor. This is your room, he said, opening a door to reveal a bedroom with a large window overlooking the valley. A brass bed with a patchwork quilt stood against one wall, with a washstand, chest of drawers, and small dressing table completing the furnishings. Fresh flowers, more wildflowers like the ones he had greeted her with, stood in a blue glass vase on the bedside table. It's lovely, she said, genuinely surprised by the thoughtfulness evident in the preparation. Grant set her trunk at the foot of the bed. My room is across the hall. The bathroom is at the end, with a proper bathtub. I had indoor plumbing installed last year, one of the few ranches in the territory that has it. The kitchen is downstairs at the back of the house, along with the dining room. There's a study off the parlor that I use for ranch business. He paused, seeming uncertain. I'll let you settle in. You must be tired. There's cold chicken and bread in the kitchen if you're hungry, but I understand if you'd prefer to rest. Prudence nodded, suddenly aware of the exhaustion that had settled into her bones after days of travel. Thank you, she said. I think I would like to rest now. Of course. Grant moved toward the door, then stopped. Prudence, he said, her name still sounding strange in his voice, I want you to know that I meant what I said in town about giving you time. We'll be married tomorrow as agreed, but beyond that. He shook his head slightly. I'm not the kind of man who gives orders to a wife. I hope in time we might find some common ground, some companionship, but I don't expect anything you're not willing to give. With that, he left, closing the door softly behind him. Prudence sat on the edge of the bed, her mind whirling. Nothing about this day had gone as she expected. The cruel, demanding husband she had feared had not materialized. Instead, she found herself in a comfortable home with a man who seemed determined to treat her with respect and consideration. As she unpacked her few belongings, arranging her dresses in the wardrobe and placing her mother's silver hairbrush on the dressing table, she wondered what tomorrow would bring. Marriage to a stranger, a kind stranger, perhaps, but a stranger nonetheless. And after that, a life here in this valley, far from everything familiar. She moved to the window, gazing out at the silhouettes of the mountains against the night sky. The moon was rising, casting a silver glow over the land. It was beautiful, in a wild, untamed way that both frightened and exhilarated her. Tomorrow, she would become Mrs. Grant Anderson. The thought should have terrified her, but as she prepared for bed, she found herself thinking of wildflowers and kind blue eyes, and the terror was tempered by something that felt, against all odds, like hope. The morning of her wedding dawned clear and bright, with a crispness to the air that hinted at the approaching autumn. Prudence woke to the sound of voices outside her window, the ranch hands beginning their day's work. For a moment she lay still, orienting herself in the unfamiliar room, remembering where she was and what the day would bring. She rose and went to the window. The view took her breath away in the morning light, rolling grasslands stretching to pine-covered mountains, the stream glittering like silver in the distance. Below, in the ranch yard, she could see Grant talking with his foreman, Jake. He was dressed in work clothes, his hat shading his face from the early sun. As she watched, he laughed at something Jake said, the sound carrying faintly to her window. A knock at her door startled her. "Miss Hamilton," it was Grant's voice, "are you awake?" "Yes," she called back. "One moment." She quickly pulled on her dressing gown over her nightdress and opened the door a crack. Grant stood in the hallway, already fully dressed for the day. "Good morning," he said. "I've prepared breakfast if you're hungry, and I've arranged for us to go to town at 11 for the ceremony." "I thought you might want some time to prepare. You made breakfast?" she asked, surprised. A slight smile touched his lips. "I've been fending for myself for many years, Miss Hamilton. I'm not entirely helpless in the kitchen, though I confess I'm looking forward to meals that don't involve scorched edges." Despite her nervousness about the day ahead, Prudence found herself smiling back. "I'll be down shortly." Once dressed in a simple blue dress, her best, saved for this occasion, she made her way downstairs to find Grant in the kitchen, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. The table was set with plates of eggs, bacon, and biscuits that looked surprisingly appetizing. "You seem skilled enough in the kitchen," she observed as she took a seat at the table. Grant set a mug of coffee before her. "Basic survival," he replied, taking the chair opposite. "But there's a difference between cooking because you must and cooking because you enjoy it. I've always suspected that food tastes better when prepared by someone who takes pleasure in the task." "I do enjoy cooking," Prudence admitted. "My mother taught me from a young age. She believed it was an art as much as a necessity." "Then I look forward to being the beneficiary of your art," Grant said, raising his coffee in a small salute. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Grant spoke again. "I've invited the ranch hands to accompany us to town for the ceremony. I hope you don't mind." "They're the closest thing to family I have here." "Of course not," Prudence replied. "They seem like good men." Grant nodded. "They are. Most have been with me for years. Jake since the beginning." He hesitated, then added, "There's something you should know about Jake. He's half Ute. His mother was from the tribe that once lived in these valleys. Some folks in town don't take kindly to that, but he's the best foreman a ranch could have, and I'd trust him with my life." Prudence considered this information. In Boston, she had rarely encountered anyone of Native American heritage, but she had no prejudice against them. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I'll be sure to treat him with the respect he deserves." Relief flickered across Grant's face. "Good. I've seen too many people treat him poorly because of his heritage. It says more about them than it does about Jake." After breakfast, Grant left to attend to some ranch business before their departure for town, giving Prudence time to prepare for the ceremony. She washed thoroughly using the basin in her room, then changed into her one good dress again, a deep blue poplin with white lace at the collar and cuffs. It wasn't a proper wedding gown, but it was the best she had. As she pinned her hair up in a simple but elegant style, she found herself wishing for her mother's presence. Elizabeth Hamilton had been a gentle, loving woman who would have helped her daughter prepare for her wedding day with joy and wisdom. Instead, Prudence was alone, about to marry a man she had known for less than a day. Yet, as she secured the final pin in her hair and studied her reflection, she realized that she wasn't as frightened as she had expected to be. Grant Anderson had shown her nothing but kindness and respect since her arrival. While she couldn't claim to know him well, her instincts told her he was a good man. A knock at the door announced that it was time to leave. When she opened it, she found Grant waiting in the hallway, dressed in what was clearly his best suit, dark gray wool with a crisp white shirt and black string tie. His hair was neatly combed and he had trimmed his beard. He looked, Prudence thought with surprise, quite handsome. "You look beautiful," Grant said, his eyes warm as they took in her appearance. "Thank you," she replied, feeling a flush rise to her cheeks. "You look very nice as well." He offered her his arm and she took it, aware of the solid strength beneath the wool sleeve. They descended the stairs together and went outside, where a wagon was waiting. Unlike the utilitarian buckboard of yesterday, this was a smaller, more elegant vehicle with a padded bench seat and freshly painted wheels. "I use this for special occasions," Grant explained as he helped her up. "Seemed appropriate for today." The ranch hands were mounted on horseback, ready to accompany them to town. Jake tipped his hat to Prudence. "You make a fine bride, madam," he said, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan," she replied, returning his smile. The journey to town was filled with teasing banter between Grant and his men, with Jake sharing stories of Grant's early days at the ranch, much to his employer's mock dismay. Prudence found herself laughing more than once at tales of cattle drives gone awry and Grant's first disastrous attempt at breaking a wild horse. "Don't believe half of what Jake tells you," Grant advised her, but there was no real annoyance in his tone, only affection for his longtime friend. Copper Creek looked different in the bright morning light, more vibrant and established than it had seemed upon her arrival. As they drove down the main street, people called out greetings and several women waved from the boardwalk. "News travels fast," Grant commented. "Everyone knows we're getting married today." They stopped at the small white church at the end of the street. Reverend Walsh, a kindly older man with a shock of white hair, met them at the door. "Welcome, welcome," he said, shaking Grant's hand and bowing slightly to Prudence. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Hamilton. Grant has spoken highly of you." Prudence glanced at Grant, wondering what he could possibly have said when he knew so little about her, but his expression revealed nothing. Inside the church, she was surprised to find several townspeople already seated in the pews. Mrs. Finch from the hotel, Mr. Wells from the general store, and a dozen or so others she didn't recognize. "The town likes to turn out for weddings," Grant explained quietly. "They're not common events here." The ceremony itself was brief, but dignified. Reverend Walsh spoke of the sanctity of marriage, the commitment between husband and wife to support and cherish one another through all of life's joys and challenges. When the time came for vows, Prudence's voice shook slightly, but she spoke the traditional words clearly. Grant's deep voice was steady as he promised to love, honor, and cherish her until death parted them. When Reverend Walsh pronounced them man and wife and invited Grant to kiss his bride, Prudence felt a moment of panic. This would be their first kiss, her first kiss ever, in fact. But Grant merely leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers gently, a brief, chaste gesture that was over almost before it began. "Mrs. Anderson," he murmured as he drew back, and Prudence felt a strange flutter in her chest at the new name. There was a small reception at the hotel afterward, with cake provided by Mrs. Finch and punch served by her daughter Sarah, a pretty girl of about 18 who Prudence learned would continue to help at the ranch once a week. "Just with the heavier cleaning," Sarah assured her. "I know you'll want to manage your own household, but the ranch house is large and Grant thought you might appreciate some assistance." Prudence thanked her, touched by Grant's thoughtfulness. Throughout the reception, he remained close to her side, introducing her to the townspeople and accepting their congratulations with gracious ease. She noticed that he seemed particularly careful to introduce her to the few women present, as if understanding she would need female companionship in her new life. "Mrs. Collins runs the dress shop," he told her, presenting her to a fashionable woman in her 40s. "She makes the finest garments in the territory. You must come visit the shop," Mrs. Collins said warmly. "It's so nice to have another civilized woman in the area. We have a sewing circle that meets every Tuesday afternoon. You'd be most welcome." By the time they left town in the late afternoon, Prudence had received invitations to the sewing circle, a church social, and a dinner at the home of the town doctor and his wife. It seemed that as Mrs. Grant Anderson, she would not lack for social opportunities, despite the ranch's relative isolation. The ride back to the ranch was quieter than the journey into town had been. The ranch hands rode ahead, giving the newlyweds some privacy. Prudence found herself sneaking glances at the man beside her husband. The word still felt strange, almost unreal. "Did it meet your expectations?" Grant asked, catching one of her glances. The wedding? Yes, it was lovely, she replied. I didn't expect so many people to attend. I meant coming to Colorado, he clarified, becoming a mail-order bride, meeting me. There was a note of vulnerability in his voice that surprised her. Prudence considered the question. I didn't have many expectations, she said honestly, or rather, I had fears more than expectations. Grant's hands tightened on the reins. What did you fear? She hesitated, unsure how much honesty the moment called for. I feared you would be cruel, she admitted finally. That you would see me as property, not a person, that I would be little more than a servant in your home. Grant was silent for a long moment. I'm sorry you had those fears, he said at last. I suppose they were not unreasonable, given the nature of our arrangement. You've proven them unfounded, Prudence said quickly, not wanting him to think she still harbored such concerns. He glanced at her, his expression serious. I hope to continue doing so. When they arrived back at the ranch, the hands dispersed to their duties with calls of congratulations and a few good-natured jests that made Grant shake his head in mock exasperation. As he helped Prudence down from the wagon, he seemed suddenly uncertain. I've asked Jake's wife, Morning Star, to prepare a special dinner for us, he said. She'll bring it over at sundown. I thought you might not want to cook on your wedding day. Jake is married. Prudence asked, surprised that this hadn't been mentioned before. Grant nodded. Yes, to a Ute woman from his mother's tribe. They live in a cabin about a mile from here. She doesn't come to the ranch often. She's shy around strangers, but she's an excellent cook. That was very thoughtful of you, Prudence said, genuinely touched by his consideration. Inside the house, an awkwardness descended between them. They were husband and wife now, legally bound, but still essentially strangers. Grant seemed as uncertain as she felt, standing in the parlor with his hat in his hands. Would you like to change before dinner? He asked finally. You must be tired of your formal clothes after the day's events. Prudence nodded, grateful for the suggestion. Yes, I think I would. Upstairs in her room, their room? No, he had said it was hers. She changed into a simpler dress and let down her hair, brushing it until it shone. As she looked out the window at the ranch spread below, she found herself wondering what her life would be like here. Would she grow to care for Grant? Would he care for her? Or would their marriage remain a pragmatic arrangement, civil but loveless? The sound of a wagon approaching drew her attention. Through the window, she could see a small cart driven by a woman in a colorful dress who must be Morning Star, Jake's wife. Prudence went downstairs, curious to meet this woman who lived between two worlds. Grant was already outside, helping Morning Star unload several covered dishes from the cart. He introduced them, and Prudence was struck by the woman's beauty-high cheekbones, large dark eyes, and glossy black hair worn in two long braids. Morning Star spoke perfect English, but with a musical lilt that hinted at another language beneath. Welcome to your new home, Morning Star said, her smile shy but genuine. Jake and I have prepared a traditional meal to celebrate your union. Thank you, Prudence replied, feeling strangely touched by the gesture. It's very kind of you. Morning Star helped them set out the food on the dining table before departing with a gentle nod. The meal was sumptuous venison stew, corn cakes, wild rice with berries, and a honey-sweetened dessert that Morning Star called wajepi. This is delicious, Prudence said after tasting the stew, rich with herbs she couldn't identify. Grant nodded, looking pleased. Morning Star is teaching me about the edible plants that grow wild around here. The Ute have knowledge that could fill books if anyone bothered to write it down. They ate in companionable silence for a while, the awkwardness between them easing somewhat with the shared enjoyment of good food. As they finished the meal, Grant cleared his throat. I have something for you, he said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small box and placed it on the table between them. A wedding gift. Surprised, Prudence opened the box to find a delicate silver pendant in the shape of a wildflower suspended on a fine chain. It's beautiful, she murmured, lifting it from the box. I had it made in Denver last month, Grant explained. When Mr. Wells travels there for supplies, he sometimes takes commissions for items we can't get here in Copper Creek. Prudence looked up at him, genuinely moved. Thank you. I didn't expect that is, I don't have anything for you. Grant smiled, the expression transforming his face. Your presence here is gift enough, Prudence. I've been alone a long time, she returned his smile hesitantly. Would you help me put it on? He rose and came to stand behind her chair. Prudence lifted her hair as he fastened the clasp at the nape of her neck, his fingers warm against her skin. The gesture felt intimate in a way that their brief wedding kiss had not. There, he said softly, returning to his seat. The pendant rested just below the hollow of her throat, catching the light from the oil lamp on the table. After dinner, they moved to the parlor. Grant built a small fire to ward off the evening chill, and they sat on opposite ends of the sofa. The flames cast a warm, flickering light across the room, making it feel cozy despite its simplicity. Tell me about yourself, Grant said after a moment of silence. Your letters were informative but brief. I know you're from Boston and that your parents passed away, but little else. Prudence traced the pattern on the sofa arm with one finger. There isn't much to tell. My father was a bookkeeper for a shipping firm. We lived modestly but comfortably until the influenza took both my parents last year. The medical bills consumed what little savings they had, and I found myself alone with debts I couldn't pay. I'm sorry for your loss, Grant said, and there was genuine sympathy in his voice. She nodded, accepting his condolence. I worked at a millinery shop for a time, but the wages barely covered my room and board when I saw your advertisement. She trailed off, unsure how to explain her decision to marry a stranger in a distant territory. You saw a way out, Grant finished for her. Yes, she admitted. Though I was terrified. The stories one hears about the West, about the men who seek wives through advertisements, they're not always flattering. Grant's expression darkened slightly. No, I suppose they're not. Some men do treat mail-order brides abominably. I've seen it happen here in the territory. Women brought out from the East, treated little better than servants or worse. He leaned forward, his eyes intent on hers. I want you to know, Prudence, that was never my intention. Why did you place the advertisement? She asked, the question that had been on her mind since their first meeting finally finding voice. You're not. She hesitated, then continued, You're not what I expected. You're young, successful, not unpleasant to look at. Surely there were women here who would have married you. A shadow passed over Grant's face. Not many unmarried women in Copper Creek, he said, and those few are quite young, barely more than girls. I wanted a wife, not a child to raise. He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully, and I suppose I wanted someone who didn't know my history. Prudence waited, sensing there was more to the story but unwilling to press if he wasn't ready to share it. Grant stared into the fire for a long moment before continuing. I was married before, he said finally. In Philadelphia before I came west. Her name was Margaret. She died in childbirth along with our son. I was 22. I'm so sorry, Prudence said softly, understanding now the shadows she sometimes glimpsed in his eyes. He nodded once, acknowledging her sympathy. After they died, I couldn't stay in Philadelphia. Everything reminded me of them, of what I'd lost. So I came west, looking for a place where I wasn't poor Grant Anderson, the widower. I found this valley and I built something here. His gaze returned to her. But a man gets lonely. A house needs a woman's touch. A ranch needs children to inherit it someday. So you decided to find a wife, Prudence supplied. Yes, Grant's expression softened. Though I must confess, when I placed that advertisement, I never expected someone like you to answer it. Someone like me, his eyes held hers. Someone beautiful, educated, gentle. I expected a practical arrangement with a practical woman. I didn't expect. He trailed off, looking slightly embarrassed. What didn't you expect? Prudence asked, curious despite herself. Grant shook his head. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you're here now, and I'll do everything in my power to make sure you never regret your decision. The conversation shifted to lighter topics after that. Grant told her about the ranch's seasonal rhythms, about the upcoming cattle drive to Denver, about the harsh winters and glorious springs. Prudence found herself relaxing in his company, laughing at his dry wit, impressed by his knowledge of the land and its creatures. When the clock on the mantel struck 10, Grant rose. "It's been a long day," he said. "We should probably retire." And just like that, the comfortable atmosphere evaporated, replaced by the looming reality of what traditionally happened on a wedding night. Prudence felt heat rise to her cheeks as she stood, smoothing her skirts nervously. Grant must have read her apprehension in her expression. "I meant what I said yesterday," he told her quietly. "Your room is yours. I won't come to you until you invite me." Relief and something like disappointment mingled in Prudence's chest. "Thank you," she said. "I'm not. That is, I've never." "I understand," Grant said, saving her from having to finish the awkward sentence. "Marriage is a significant adjustment even without the physical aspects. We have time, Prudence. I'm a patient man." They ascended the stairs together, parting at her door with a formal good night. As Prudence prepared for bed, she found herself thinking about the man sleeping across the hall, her husband, yet still largely a mystery to her. He had shown her nothing but kindness and respect, had given her flowers instead of orders, had promised patience when he could have demanded his rights. She touched the silver pendant at her throat, a tangible symbol of his thoughtfulness. Perhaps, she thought as she drifted toward sleep, perhaps this arranged marriage might become something more than a practical necessity after all. The first weeks of marriage brought a steady rhythm to Prudence's days. She rose early, preparing breakfast for Grant before he headed out to work with the ranch hands. The mornings were spent cleaning, baking, and tending to the vegetable garden behind the house. In the afternoons, she might do laundry, mend clothes, or work on sewing projects. Grant returned for the midday meal when he could, though often his work kept him in distant pastures until evening. Despite the physical demands of ranch life, Prudence found herself enjoying the routine. There was satisfaction in seeing Grant's appreciation for her cooking, in watching bread rise under her hands, in harvesting vegetables she had tended herself. The house, already neat when she arrived, became truly comfortable under her care, with fresh flowers on the tables and curtains she had sewn herself at the windows. In the evenings, after supper, they would sit in the parlor together. Sometimes Grant worked on ranch accounts while Prudence sewed or read. Other times they talked, gradually revealing more of themselves to each other. Grant told her about his childhood in Pennsylvania, about his father's small farm and his mother's love of books. Prudence shared stories of Boston, of the museums and libraries she had loved to visit, of the busy harbor with ships from all over the world. The ranch hands, initially cautious around her, soon warmed to Prudence's gentle manner and genuine interest in their work. Jake Sullivan, in particular, became a friend rather than merely an employee. He would often join them for Sunday dinners, sometimes bringing Morning Star and their 2 young sons. True to his word, Grant had not pressed for the physical consummation of their marriage. He was unfailingly considerate, treating Prudence with a gentle courtesy that gradually eroded her initial wariness. Each night they parted at her bedroom door with nothing more than a good night, and sometimes, if Grant was feeling particularly bold, a brief touch of his hand to hers. Yet as the weeks passed, Prudence found herself growing increasingly aware of him as a man, not just as a provider or protector. She noticed the strength in his arms as he chopped wood for the stove, the grace with which he rode his horse, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed at one of Jake's stories. And sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, she caught him watching her with an intensity that made her heart beat faster. One evening in late October, as the first frost silvered the grass outside, Prudence sat in the parlor working on a quilt. Grant had ridden to a neighboring ranch earlier that day to help with a difficult calving and had not yet returned. As the hours passed and darkness fell, she found herself growing increasingly anxious, peering out the window at the moonlit yard with increasing frequency. When the sound of hoofbeats finally came, near midnight, she rushed to the door, relief flooding through her. Grant dismounted wearily, his face drawn with exhaustion in the light spilling from the open door. "You're still awake," he said, sounding surprised as he climbed the porch steps. "I was worried," Prudence admitted, stepping back to let him enter. "It's late and the night is cold." Grant removed his hat and coat, hanging them on the pegs by the door. The calving was difficult. We lost the mother but saved the calf. Jim Peterson will raise it by hand now. He moved toward the parlor and Prudence noticed he was limping slightly. Are you hurt? She asked, concerned. The mare stepped on my foot, he explained with a rueful smile. Nothing broken, but it's sore. Sit down, she instructed, guiding him to the sofa. I'll make you some tea and then you should soak that foot in hot water. Grant looked about to protest, then nodded, sinking gratefully onto the sofa. When Prudence returned with the tea, she found him with his head tipped back against the cushions, eyes closed. For a moment, she simply looked at him, at the strong line of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows, the way his chest rose and fell with each steady breath. Grant, she said softly, and his eyes opened, finding hers immediately. I'm sorry, he said, straightening. I didn't mean to fall asleep. You're exhausted, she replied, handing him the tea. Drink this and then I'll help you upstairs. He took the cup, his fingers brushing hers. You're very kind, Prudence. She felt a flush rise to her cheeks at the warmth in his voice. It's nothing. Any wife would do the same. Grant's eyes held hers for a long moment. No, he said quietly, not any wife. After he had drunk his tea, Prudence insisted on preparing a basin of hot water for his injured foot. She placed it before him in the parlor, then knelt to help him remove his boot and sock. It was the most intimate thing she had done for him in their weeks of marriage, and she felt a strange nervousness as her fingers worked at his bootlaces. You don't have to do this, Grant said, watching her with an unreadable expression. I want to, she replied, easing the boot off as gently as possible. When his foot was bare, she could see it was already bruising, a dark patch spreading across the instep. Oh, Grant, she murmured. This must be painful, he shrugged. I've had worse. Carefully, she helped him place his foot in the basin of water. A small sigh escaped him as the warmth eased the ache. Better, she asked, still kneeling beside the basin. Much, he confirmed. His hand came up to brush a strand of hair from her face, the gesture so unexpected that Prudence froze, her eyes flying to his. Thank you, he said softly. Later, after his foot was soaked and dried, she helped him up the stairs to his bedroom. It was the first time she had entered the room, and she looked around with curiosity. It was simpler than hers, with a large bed, a dresser, and a small writing desk. A bookshelf held volumes that appeared well-read, their spines cracked and worn. Will you be all right? She asked as Grant sat on the edge of his bed. He nodded, looking up at her with tired eyes. Yes, thanks to your care. Prudence hesitated, then impulsively leaned down and pressed a quick kiss to his forehead. Good night, then, she said, retreating before she could see his reaction. In her own room, she prepared for bed with trembling hands, wondering at her own boldness. It had been a simple gesture of comfort, the kind a wife might naturally offer a weary husband, yet it felt like a step across some invisible boundary they had maintained since her arrival. The next morning, she found Grant already in the kitchen when she came downstairs, his foot propped on a stool as he sipped coffee at the table. His eyes found hers immediately, and something in his expression made her heart quicken. Good morning, she said, moving to the stove to begin breakfast preparations. Good morning, he replied. I've asked Jake to handle the day's work. I thought I should rest this foot on doctor's orders. Prudence turned to look at him. Doctor's orders? What doctor? A smile played at the corners of his mouth. Dr. Prudence Anderson, who prescribed hot soaks and rest. She felt herself smile in return. A very wise doctor, I'm sure. The wisest, he agreed, his eyes warm on hers. That day was different from the others that had preceded it. With Grant in the house, Prudence found herself constantly aware of his presence as she went about her tasks. He sat in the parlor with account books spread before him, but often when she passed the doorway, she would catch him watching her rather than working. After the midday meal, he asked if she would read to him. To pass the time, he explained, but there was something in his expression that suggested he simply wanted her company. Prudence selected a volume of Tennyson's poetry from the bookshelf and settled into a chair near his. As she read, her voice gaining confidence with each verse, she became aware of Grant's eyes on her face, studying her with an intensity that made her stumble over words she knew well. And on her lover's arm she leant, she read, And round her waist she felt it fold, slash, and far across the hills they went slash in that new world which is the old. She paused, looking up to find Grant watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "You believe in that?" he asked quietly. "In love transforming the world, making it new again." Prudence closed the book, her finger marking her place. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "My parents loved each other deeply, and I saw how it brightened their lives, even in difficult times. But I've never experienced it myself." "Never." His voice was soft, almost hesitant. She shook her head. "No, there was a young man in Boston who called on me once or twice, but I felt nothing for him beyond mild friendship, and then my parents died and there was no time for such things." Grant nodded slowly. "I loved Margaret," he said after a moment. "We were young, and perhaps it wasn't the grand passion poets write about, but it was real. When she died, I thought that part of me died with her." "And now?" Prudence asked, her heart beating faster. His eyes met hers, clear and direct. "Now I'm beginning to think I was wrong." The air between them seemed to vibrate with unspoken words. Prudence found she couldn't look away from him, couldn't break the connection that had suddenly formed between them. The moment was shattered by a knock at the front door. Grant's expression shifted to one of mild annoyance as Prudence rose to answer it. It was Mrs. Collins from the dress shop in town, accompanied by Sarah Finch. "We've come to kidnap you for the sewing circle," Mrs. Collins announced cheerfully. "Sarah told me you haven't been to town since your wedding, and that simply won't do. A new bride needs female companionship." Caught off guard, Prudence glanced back toward the parlor where Grant sat. "I'm not sure I should leave. My husband is injured." "Nonsense," Grant called, appearing in the doorway. "I'm perfectly capable of fending for myself for an afternoon. Go and enjoy yourself, Prudence. Meet your neighbors." Still hesitating, Prudence looked at him questioningly. He smiled and nodded encouragingly. "Truly, I'll be fine. You've been working hard since you arrived. You deserve some recreation." And so, Prudence found herself in Mrs. Collins's buggy, heading toward town for an afternoon of sewing and female conversation. The sewing circle, held in the church's social hall, consisted of 8 women ranging in age from Sarah's 18 years to Mrs. Greeley, the minister's wife, who was well into her 60s. They welcomed Prudence warmly, exclaiming over her fine stitching and asking numerous questions about her life before coming to Colorado and her adjustment to ranch life. Most were genuinely friendly, though Prudence detected a note of curiosity, even skepticism, in some of their inquiries. "And how are you finding married life, Mrs. Anderson?" asked a woman named Eliza Johnson, wife of the town's banker. There was something in her tone that suggested the question wasn't as innocent as it appeared. "Very well, thank you," Prudence replied politely, focusing on her stitching. "It must be a significant adjustment," Mrs. Johnson persisted. "Coming all the way from Boston to marry a man you'd never met, a man with Grant Anderson's history." Prudence looked up sharply. "My husband has been nothing but kind and considerate." Mrs. Johnson exchanged glances with another woman. "Of course he has. It's just that, well, we were all rather surprised when he chose to seek a bride from the East rather than here in Colorado." "I believe there were few eligible women in Copper Creek," Prudence said, remembering Grant's explanation. "Few who would have him, perhaps," Mrs. Johnson murmured, just loud enough to be heard. Mrs. Collins cleared her throat loudly. "Eliza, that's quite enough. We're here to welcome Mrs. Anderson to our community, not gossip about her husband." But the damage was done. Prudence spent the remainder of the afternoon wondering what history Mrs. Johnson had been referring to. Grant had told her about his first wife and child, about coming west to escape painful memories. What else was there? What reason could the women of Copper Creek have had for rejecting him as a potential husband? The ride back to the ranch was quiet, with Sarah chattering nervously as if sensing Prudence's discomfort. When they arrived, Grant was sitting on the front porch, his injured foot propped on a stool. He waved as the buggy approached, and despite her troubled thoughts, Prudence felt a surge of gladness at the sight of him. "Did you enjoy the sewing circle?" he asked as he helped her down from the buggy, his hands strong and warm at her waist. "Yes," she lied, not wanting to worry him with Mrs. Johnson's insinuations. The ladies were very welcoming. Grant studied her face, his expression suggesting he didn't entirely believe her but wouldn't press the issue. "I'm glad. It's important for you to have friends here, not just be isolated at the ranch with me and the hands." After supper that evening, as they sat in the parlor, Prudence found she couldn't concentrate on her sewing. The unfinished conversation from before her trip to town and the troubling comments from Mrs. Johnson swirled in her mind. "Is something bothering you?" Grant asked finally, setting aside the book he had been reading. "You've been quiet since you returned from town." Prudence hesitated, then decided on directness. "Mrs. Johnson made some comments today," she said, "about your history. She seemed surprised that any woman from the East would agree to marry you." Grant's expression darkened. "Eliza Johnson has a sharp tongue and a long memory," he said after a moment. "She's never forgiven me for refusing to sell my water rights to her husband's bank 5 years ago." "Is that all it was?" Prudence asked, relief mingling with lingering doubt. Grant sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Not entirely. When I first came to Copper Creek, I was different, angry, reckless. I drank too much, fought too often. It took Jake nearly getting killed pulling me out of a bar brawl to make me see what I was becoming." Prudence tried to reconcile this image with the steady, thoughtful man she had come to know. "What happened?" "Jake knocked some sense into me, quite literally," Grant said with a rueful smile. "Told me I could either drink myself to death in someone else's saloon or build something of my own that would last. I chose the latter, but some folks in town still remember the man I was, not the man I've become." "Is that why you sought a bride from the East, because of your reputation here?" Grant met her eyes squarely. "Partly," he admitted, "but also because I wanted someone who would see me as I am now, not as I was then, someone who might in time come to care for me despite my past mistakes." The honesty in his voice moved her. "Thank you for telling me," she said softly. "No more secrets between us, Prudence," he replied. "If you have questions, I want you to ask them. I want you to know me, all of me." She nodded, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. "And I want you to know me." They talked late into the evening, sharing stories and thoughts they had previously kept to themselves. Grant spoke of his grief after losing Margaret and their son, of the dark years that followed. Prudence told him of her fears upon coming west, of her relief at finding him kind rather than cruel. When the clock struck midnight, they were sitting side by side on the sofa, their hands not quite touching on the cushion between them. The fire had burned low, casting a warm, golden glow across the room. "It's late," Grant said, his voice low. "We should retire." Prudence nodded, but neither of them moved. In the flickering light, his face seemed different, somehow more open, more vulnerable than she had seen it before. "Prudence," he began, then stopped, seeming to search for words. "These past weeks, getting to know you, it's been—" "Yes." She prompted when he didn't continue, his eyes found hers. "I didn't expect to feel this way again," he said simply, her heart quickened. "What way?" Instead of answering with words, Grant leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. When she didn't, he brushed his lips against hers, a kiss so gentle it was barely there. "That way," he murmured as he drew back slightly. Prudence felt a warmth spread through her, a fluttering sensation in her chest that she had never experienced before. Without thinking, she raised one hand to his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, feeling the slight roughness of evening stubble against her skin. Grant's eyes darkened at her touch. "Prudence," he said, her name a question and a plea. In answer, she leaned forward and returned his kiss, tentative at first, then with growing confidence as his arms came around her, drawing her closer. His lips were warm and firm against hers, his embrace strong yet gentle. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing quickly. Grant rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if savoring the moment. "I should go to my room," Prudence whispered, though she made no move to leave his embrace. Grant nodded, slowly releasing her. "Yes," he agreed, though his eyes told a different story. "We have time. All the time we need." They climbed the stairs together, their fingers intertwined. At her bedroom door, Grant lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Good night, wife," he said softly. "Good night, husband," she replied, the words carrying a new warmth, a new meaning. As Prudence prepared for bed, her lips still tingling from his kiss, she realized that something fundamental had changed between them. What had begun as a pragmatic arrangement was becoming something else entirely, something that made her heart race and her spirit soar. Something that felt, against all odds, like the beginning of love. November brought the first snow to the valley, transforming the landscape into a pristine wonderland of white. Prudence woke one morning to find the world outside her window hushed and glistening, the familiar view made new by the blanket of snow that covered everything. She dressed quickly, drawn by the beauty outside, and hurried downstairs. Grant was already in the kitchen, stoking the stove to drive away the morning chill. "It's beautiful," she said, moving to stand beside him at the window that overlooked the ranch yard. He smiled down at her, his arm coming naturally around her waist. Since that first kiss in the parlor, their relationship had evolved rapidly, physical affection becoming an easy, everyday occurrence between them. Hands held while reading in the evening, kisses exchanged before Grant left for his day's work, embraces that lingered longer each day. "The first snow is always beautiful," Grant agreed. "By February you may feel differently about it." Prudence leaned into his warmth. "I've never seen snow like this, so pure, so untouched. In Boston, it turned gray and slushy almost immediately." Grant pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Then you should enjoy it while it's perfect. After breakfast, I'll show you the view from the North Ridge. The valley looks like something from a painting when it's freshly covered in snow." True to his word, after they had eaten, Grant saddled 2 horses and helped Prudence onto a gentle mare named Daisy. Though she had learned to ride shortly after arriving at the ranch, she was still somewhat nervous on horseback, especially in the snow. But with Grant riding beside her, she felt secure. They rode north through the pastures, now empty of cattle as the herd had been moved to more sheltered grazing land for the winter. The snow crunched beneath the horses' hooves, and their breath formed clouds in the crisp air. Despite the cold, Prudence felt warm in her wool coat and gloves, exhilarated by the bright winter sunlight and the companionable silence between her and Grant. When they reached the ridge, Grant dismounted and helped Prudence down, his hands lingering at her waist. Together, they stood looking out over the valley, where the ranch buildings looked like toy models in the distance, smoke rising in a thin column from the chimney of their home. "It's breathtaking," Prudence said, taking in the sweep of white land, the dark green of the pine forests, the distant mountains sharp against the blue sky. "Yes," Grant agreed, but when she turned to look at him, he was watching her, not the view. His eyes were warm despite the cold air, and there was something in them that made her breath catch. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. He shook his head slightly. "Sometimes I still can't believe you're here," he said, "that you chose to come west to marry me." "I didn't have many choices," she reminded him gently. "No," he agreed, "but you could have found another position in Boston or married someone there. You were brave enough to venture into the unknown instead." He took her gloved hand in his. "I'm grateful for that courage every day." Prudence felt warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with her heavy coat. "I am too," she said softly, "grateful for your kindness, for the home you've given me, for—" She hesitated, then added, "for you, Grant." His smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. Slowly, he drew her into his arms, and she went willingly, tipping her face up to his. The kiss they shared was deeper, more urgent than those that had come before. Prudence felt herself responding with a passion that surprised her, her arms tightening around his neck as his hands pressed against her back, drawing her closer. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing heavily, their breath mingling in the cold air between them. "We should go back," Grant said, his voice rough, "before we freeze standing here." Prudence nodded, though part of her would have been content to stay in his arms, regardless of the cold. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts, yet connected by the invisible thread that had been strengthening between them since that first evening in the parlor. That night, after supper, they sat in the parlor as usual. Grant was reading, but Prudence found she couldn't concentrate on her sewing, her mind returning again and again to the moment on the ridge, to the feeling of his arms around her, his lips on hers. Grant, she said suddenly, setting aside her work. He looked up, his expression quizzical. Yes. Prudence took a deep breath. Would you? That is, I was wondering if, she faltered, unused to being so forward. Grant set his book aside, his full attention on her. What is it, Prudence? She met his eyes, gathering her courage. Would you like to stay with me tonight, in my room? For a moment he seemed frozen, and Prudence feared she had misunderstood, had been too bold. Then his expression softened into a smile that made her heart race. Are you sure? He asked, his voice gentle. There's no rush, Prudence. I meant what I said about giving you time. I'm sure, she said, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. I don't want to wait any longer. Grant crossed the room in 2 strides, taking her hands and pulling her to her feet. His kiss was tender yet filled with a restrained passion that told her how long he had been waiting for this moment. My beautiful, brave wife, he murmured against her lips. That night, in the privacy of her bedroom, their bedroom now, Prudence discovered the final piece of marriage that had been missing from their arrangement. Grant was as gentle and considerate a lover as he had been a husband, patient with her inexperience, attentive to her needs and responses. And Prudence found, to her surprise and delight, that physical love was not the duty she had feared, but a joy she had never imagined. Afterward, lying in his arms with her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, Prudence felt a sense of completeness, of rightness, that she had never expected to find when she boarded that train in Boston. What are you thinking? Grant asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. Prudence smiled in the darkness. I'm thinking about the day I arrived, she said. How frightened I was, how certain you would be cruel, demanding, and then you were waiting with wildflowers instead of orders. Grant's arm tightened around her. I was nervous too, he admitted, afraid you would take one look at me and this remote ranch and flee on the next train east. Never, Prudence said, raising herself on one elbow to look down at his face, dimly visible in the moonlight filtering through the curtains. This is my home now, you are my home. His hand came up to cup her face, his touch reverent. I love you, Prudence, he said softly. I didn't expect to when I sent that advertisement. I thought perhaps we might develop a companionable affection in time. I never imagined. He shook his head slightly. I never imagined you. Tears pricked at Prudence's eyes, happy tears that spilled over as she leaned down to kiss him. I love you too, she whispered against his lips. So much more than I thought possible. In the weeks that followed, their marriage deepened and strengthened. The physical intimacy they now shared only enhanced the emotional connection that had been building since Prudence's arrival. They still had their separate duties, Grant managing the ranch, Prudence the household, but they moved through their days with a new awareness of each other, a new appreciation for the partnership they were building. As Christmas approached, Prudence found herself wanting to make the holiday special for Grant. From conversations, she had gathered that he hadn't celebrated much in the years since coming west, treating December 25th as little more than another day on the ranch. Christmas was Margaret's favorite holiday, he explained one evening when Prudence asked about his traditions. After she died, I couldn't bear to celebrate it, and then out here it seemed easier just to let the day pass without marking it. Would it bother you if we celebrated this year? Prudence asked carefully, not wanting to stir painful memories. Grant considered the question, his expression thoughtful rather than troubled. No, he said finally. I think it's time, a new beginning. And so Prudence set about preparing for Christmas with enthusiasm. She baked cookies and fruit pies, using precious supplies of sugar and spices ordered from Denver. She sewed new curtains for the parlor and a warm flannel shirt for Grant, working on the latter in secret when he was out with the hands. Grant, for his part, disappeared mysteriously for an entire afternoon, returning with a burlap-wrapped bundle that he stashed in the barn, refusing to tell Prudence what it contained despite her curious questions. On Christmas Eve, Grant and Jake rode into the foothills and returned with a small pine tree, which they set up in the parlor. Prudence decorated it with paper ornaments she had crafted, strings of dried berries, and small candles in holders that clipped to the branches. It wasn't as elaborate as the Christmas trees of her childhood in Boston, but as she stood back to admire it, with Grant's arm around her waist, she thought it was the most beautiful tree she had ever seen. They invited the ranch hands, along with Jake's family, for Christmas dinner the next day, but Christmas Eve was just for the two of them. After a simple but special supper, they exchanged gifts by the light of the tree's candles. Prudence presented Grant with the shirt she had made, along with a leather-bound journal she had ordered from Denver through Mr. Wells. "For your thoughts," she explained as he ran his hand over the smooth cover. "You told me once that you used to write before you came west." Grant looked surprised and touched. "I didn't think you would remember that," he said. "Thank you. It's been a long time since I put my thoughts on paper, but perhaps it's time to start again." He disappeared briefly to the barn, returning with the burlap-wrapped bundle, which turned out to contain a rocking chair made of polished pine. "I made it," he said, almost shyly, as Prudence ran her hands over the smooth arms. "Been working on it in the evenings when I told you I was checking on a sick calf. It's beautiful," Prudence said, genuinely impressed by his craftsmanship. "I didn't know you could make furniture," Grant shrugged. "My father taught me woodworking when I was a boy. I'm out of practice, but—" He hesitated, then added, "I thought you might like a rocking chair, for when? That is, if we ever have children, for rocking them to sleep." Prudence's heart swelled at the thought, at the image his words conjured herself sitting in this chair, a baby in her arms, Grant watching them with love in his eyes. "It's perfect," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "The most wonderful gift I've ever received." Later, as they lay in bed, Prudence's head on Grant's shoulder and his arms around her, she thought about the journey that had brought her here from the desperate decision to become a mail-order bride to the deep, abiding love she now felt for her husband. If someone had told her as she boarded that train in Boston that she would find not just security but true happiness in the Colorado wilderness, she would never have believed it. "What are you smiling about?" Grant asked, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Us," she replied simply. "How unlikely it all seems, and yet how right." He tightened his arms around her. "The best decisions sometimes look like the hardest ones at the time," he said. "Coming west was the hardest thing I'd ever done until it became the best thing." "Becoming a mail-order bride seemed like surrender," Prudence admitted. "Like giving up on dreams I didn't even know I had, and instead—" "And instead," Grant prompted when she didn't continue. Prudence raised herself up to look into his eyes, letting all the love she felt show in her face. "And instead, I found everything I never knew I wanted." Spring came to the valley with a riot of wildflowers and new life. The cattle herd grew with the addition of calves, the vegetable garden flourished under Prudence's care, and the ranch prospered under Grant's management. And in late April, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Prudence took Grant's hand and placed it gently on her abdomen. "We're going to have a baby," she said, her voice trembling with joy and nervousness. "In November, the doctor thinks." Grant's face went still with shock, then transformed with a joy so pure it brought tears to Prudence's eyes. "A baby," he whispered, his hand spreading wide over her still flat stomach. "Are you sure?" She nodded, her own happiness reflected in his face. "Doctor Miller confirmed it yesterday when I was in town. I've suspected for a few weeks now." Grant gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "A baby," he repeated, wonder in his voice. "Our baby." There was a moment of shadow in his eyes, the memory, Prudence knew, of the child he had lost along with his first wife, but it passed quickly, replaced by determination and hope. "This time will be different," she assured him, understanding his unspoken fear. "Doctor Miller says I'm in excellent health and he'll check on me regularly." Grant nodded, pressing his forehead to hers. "I can't lose you," he said softly. "Either of you. You won't," Prudence promised, believing it with all her heart. In the months that followed, as Prudence's body changed and grew with the life inside her, their happiness only deepened. Grant was attentive to her every need, insisting she rest when she was tired, bringing her wildflowers that reminded them both of the day she had arrived at the station. The nursery, A small room adjacent to their bedroom that had once been used for storage was transformed with fresh paint and curtains Prudence sewed from soft yellow fabric. Grant crafted a cradle from the same pine as the rocking chair, working on it in the evenings while Prudence knitted tiny garments beside him. In early November, just as the first snow dusted the peaks of the distant mountains, Prudence went into labor. The hours that followed were difficult, filled with pain and fear, but also with Grant's steadfast presence. He refused to leave her side, despite the convention that men wait elsewhere during childbirth, holding her hand through each contraction, wiping her brow with a cool cloth, murmuring encouragement when her strength flagged. And when their daughter finally arrived, squalling and perfect with a dusting of dark hair and eyes that would later turn the same clear blue as her father's, the joy that filled the room was almost tangible. "She's beautiful," Grant whispered, tears streaming unashamedly down his face as he held his daughter for the first time. "Perfect, just like her mother." They named her Elizabeth Margaret Anderson, honoring both Prudence's mother and Grant's first wife in a gesture that acknowledged the past while embracing their future together. As Prudence watched Grant rock their daughter in the chair he had crafted with such love, she thought about the strange, winding path that had led her to this moment. From desperate mail-order bride to beloved wife and mother, from frightened stranger to half of a partnership built on respect, trust, and deep, abiding love, she had come west expecting cruelty and found kindness instead, had expected orders and received flowers, had feared servitude and discovered partnership, and in the process, she had found herself stronger, braver, more capable than she had ever imagined. "What are you thinking about, love?" Grant asked, looking up from their daughter's sleeping face to find Prudence watching them with a tender smile. "I'm thinking about beginnings," she said. "About how the worst days of our lives can lead to the best if we're brave enough to keep going, to take chances." Grant nodded, understanding in his eyes. "If you hadn't lost your parents, if I hadn't lost Margaret, we might never have found each other." "And now we have Elizabeth," Prudence said, reaching out to stroke her daughter's downy head. "A new beginning." "The first of many," Grant replied, leaning over to kiss her gently. "We have a lifetime of beginnings ahead of us, my love, and I can't wait to experience every one of them with you." As the first snow of winter fell softly outside their window, covering the valley in a blanket of pristine white, the little family remained nestled together in the warmth of their home. The unlikely love that had grown between a grieving rancher and a desperate mail-order bride had blossomed into something beautiful and enduring, a love that would sustain them through all the seasons of their lives together. A love that had begun, improbably, with wildflowers instead of orders on a dusty train platform in Copper Creek, Colorado.